To build anything that truly lasts, it takes time.
Hi there, I'm Sneha, and let's throw some light on the macro data that we're getting just this minute. If you take a look at the bottom of your screen, you have the flash that's talking about India's May industrial production number, and that has risen by just 1.2% on a year-on-year basis. Remember, we at ET now we're estimating this number to at least grow by 2.3%. Even if you take a look at some of the more lesser optimistic estimates, if you take a look at the other side of the barrel, you had a range of 1.5 to 2.5% growth in May. That is what ICRA was expecting, but this number has come lower than the most conservative estimate as well, and it's just a 1.2% raise that's coming in on a year-on-year basis in the month of April. If you take a look at what in the month of May, if you take a look at what we were expecting in the month of April versus what the actual number was, it was much higher than what we were estimating, and that trend seems to have reversed in just 1 month, because right now all we can see and the initial set of numbers that we have right now is a 1.2% year-on-year uptick coming in the May India industrial production numbers versus what we were expecting here at 2.3. Remember, we have some brokerage takes also coming in on the expectation. You had a note coming in from Nirmal Bang where they were expecting a 2.4% uptick. So this is a large underperformance based on what brokerages were expecting as well. Just to throw some light and to bring our viewers up to speed on what our core sector growth data for May was, that stood at just 0.7%, which was already at a 9-month low. So on this segment of the economic spectrum, it seems like we are seeing some weakness develop. The slowdown, remember, in core sector was led by electricity production, which declined 5.8% year-on-year in May 2025. Coal production also slowed to 2.8% year-on-year in May 25 compared to 3.5% in April 2024. Now, quick estimate of index of industrial production and use-based index for the month of 2025 has estimated this number to be around 1.2%. Like I spoke about, our compared to our estimates, much lower. You have May capital goods production that has risen 14.1% on a year-on-year basis. So you have the number that's coming in for capital goods production. Remember, for what we were expecting, at least on this front, we'll bring you our expectations also as well. But another factor that could be hampering this number is the early onset of monsoon that we've seen, because excess rains in the latter part of May 2025 has weighed on electricity generation in the month. So as and when we get you electricity numbers, we have them, we'll be sharing that with you as well. But remember, electricity as a segment was largely expected to be weak on the back of these unseasonal rains and the early rains that we have seen in the month of May. And this could have overall pulled the growth of the core output as well. So while that was affecting the core sector, let's understand what the first take is on India's industrial production. We have Sakshi Gupta, principal economist at HDFC Bank, joining us. And Sakshi, hi, thanks so much for joining us on the show. A mere 1.2% uptick is what we are seeing. What is your first take right off the bat when it comes to India's IIP for the month of May?
Right. Hi. Thank you for having me on the show. So, my estimate for IIP for the month was actually a little lower than what the consensus was. I was expecting 1.6% growth, but this has even undershot my rather, unoptimistic estimate. I think there are a couple of things when we're looking at the IIP data for May. One, we have to remember that there is a huge base effect that is pulling down the YOY numbers, right? So if you recall, last year in May, IIP growth overall was close to 6.3%. And specifically, you mentioned the electricity index, which, has dropped for the month of May. There again, there was a huge base effect because last year, industrial, electricity production was up, I think, close to about 13%. So one factor to keep in mind when looking at this data is this huge base. I think secondly, beyond the base, I think there is also this, moderation that you are seeing, which was reflected in the core sector data. Of course, we know the electricity story, but I think if you're looking at, mining, you're looking at even the manufacturing number, I think that has come in on the softer side. Now, this could in part be because of, what we are seeing globally, the global uncertainty, which is kind of perhaps spilling over also to domestic production. But I think what is interesting and more on the positive note is that if you look at all the infrastructure or capital goods related production, growth for the last 2 months, April and May, they have actually been holding up pretty well. So I think a part of this is being driven by, government, expenditure kind of picking up pace this year and being front loaded in some regard. So I think that a part of that benefit is flowing through that particular segment. So mixed data overall, when you look at the details, but at the headline number, clearly this is, both for the downward revision in the April number as well as May, they seem to be, showing that activity in industrial production has been muted.
So that's the first take coming in from Sakshi Gupta in terms of what this cut that we've seen in the IIP growth, this slowdown, what it could mean going ahead. But Sakshi, I want to talk to you about select sectors. We've seen growth in capital goods production along with infra goods. On the flip side, you've seen consumer durables that fallen. Does this give you any insight on how urban demand is shaping up, if at all?
Right. This is production data. It tends to be very lumpy. But if I combine this with, other indicators on the consumer side that we track, clearly on the consumer side, since last year, there has been this, moderation or unevenness in consumer demand that has been going on. I think the IIP data in general, has been reflected, has kind of been picking that up. Although more recently, as you kind of indicated, I think the last month, I don't know what is the revised number, but last month at least the consumer durables index was up. I'm not sure what is the number for this month. I haven't been able to look at the data yet, right? But I think that overall, if we look at consumer demand, clearly there is still a lot of unevenness where I think there is greater optimism on the rural side, but I'm yet to see a very meaningful increase on urban demand showing up in the hard data. And as I mentioned before, there is of course this diversion that you are seeing within the IIP data where capital goods or infrastructure related segment is growing much faster compared to your consumer production segment. So I think the capital goods or infrastructure bit, of course, is being driven by I suspect by government capital expenditure and getting some positive spillovers from that. If you look at cement in the core sector data, if you look at cement and steel production, both of them actually went up on a YOY basis in the month of May. So actually that corroborates what I'm saying in terms of, the government capital expenditure bit pushing up the IIP indices.
Right, Sakshi, and also help us understand that given this is the kind of data we've seen where your May IIP has come in at a 9-month low, what do you think the next boost or the next impetus should be from the government in order to see some sector balancing when it comes to growth performances across these segments?
Right. I think this year the story is, of course, given the global headwinds this year, the story is about looking inwards, right? So I think both from a monetary policy perspective as well as, from, the fiscal policy perspective, I think that a lot of front loading of growth supportive measures, of course, is very important. The RBI has already, front loaded its rate cuts and its support on the liquidity front. And I think that we are going to see a similar pattern from the government as well. I think somewhere down the line, by the middle of the year, perhaps we will also start seeing some benefit, to consumer demand from the tax cuts that were announced, as well as lower inflation that has been moderating for the last couple of months. So, given whatever has already been announced and with the expectations that monsoon is going to be normal and favorable for the rural economy, I think some amount of this rebalancing is going to, automatically pan out, over the coming months. That is my expectation.
Okay, so that's the take coming in from Sakshi on what to make of this IIP data that we've seen. And remember, viewers, a 1.2% uptick coming in for the May IIP data means that this is now at a 9-month low. To discuss what the path ahead could be, let's also welcome on board Saugata Bhattacharya, independent economist, who's joining us on the show. And Mr. Bhattacharya, I need your take just on that. Do you believe that now at a 9-month low, do you believe that this IIP data has bottomed out? Can we expect to see some recovery, or are we in room for some more trouble going ahead?
No, hi. So first of all, thank you for having me on your show. I think it is definitely, probably, very likely the low that we have seen. Couple of things. We already knew that a low number was coming in because of the core sector data that had come in, 40% of the IIP. So very weak primary data that we had seen. I'm very surprised to see on screen, I haven't seen the data yet, if 5.8% electricity. I believe it should be minus 5.8 because that's what the number that we had seen on the core number. And that's one of the reasons that this number has been dragged down. With a low mining index, low electricity, and manufacturing relatively okay at 2.6%. We had seen that cement and steel were still good. The second part of all this is that the base number of the May 24 IIP growth was relatively high at 6.5%. So that was another reason for a relatively weak IIP. So I believe that once electricity generation begins to would have likely have improved in June. And then we wait to see other numbers, construction numbers, etc. Government capex remains very relatively robust. So I believe that this probably is one of the low numbers for the IIP, and we are likely to see not a very robust growth, but we are likely to see an uptick in the IIP numbers going forward.
Sounding optimistic on that front, Mr. Bhattacharya. So in electricity, in the red that we are showing is a cut of 5.8%, just to make it very clear for the viewers. So, well, that's the take. But Mr. Bhattacharya, we also had Sakshi's view on this in terms of capital goods. And I want to understand, because capital goods production has surged 14.1% on a year-on-year basis. Do you think that this is a sign of revival in the overall cap goods space, or do you believe that this is just base effects kicking in?
So a couple of things. One, of course, we don't know how much of this capital goods is government capex and how much is private sector capex. Remember that last year, in the May 24 number, capital goods, because this was the month just in and prior to the elections, so government capex was very, very low at this point in time. So partially this reflects the base effect of the low government capex at this point in time. But other than that, I do believe, so from whatever we have been hearing anecdotally, some of the other numbers that we have seen going forward, that even private sector capex has begun to improve. So the almost 15% capital goods growth number probably is a reflection more of the government capex that we have seen. And this year we know from the government numbers that government capex has been front-loaded. So I think it's largely to do with government capex, but I also believe that there is, at one point in time when we see the numbers, there is also an element of private sector capex revival embedded in these high growth numbers, capital goods growth numbers.
Okay, and Sakshi, coming back to you, given that manufacturing has risen only 2.6% on a year-on-year basis, this is quite divergent from the kind of manufacturing PMI numbers that we're seeing. That's a high-frequency indicator that we track very closely. While that is looking positive, help us understand why we're seeing only a 2.6% year-on-year growth in terms of the IIP front.
Right. So if you look at the PMI number, right, for the month of May, you actually saw a moderation compared to April, right? So the moderation is also reflected in the May PMI numbers. I think, this manufacturing index is also showing you a moderation. So I don't think that the two data are actually contradictory in what they are showing. As I said earlier, I think all these data, when we are looking at 2.6% for manufacturing, or some of the electricity or capital goods number, I think we have to take into account the base effect, right? So there was a huge base even for the manufacturing index in 2024 May, right, which is pulling down some of these YOY numbers. So a part of this is explained by that. But, as I alluded to you before, if you are looking at a broader, set of indicators on the manufacturing side, right, things for the data that we have for Q1, things seem to be a little tentative in nature. It is not like we are seeing a huge rebound or recovery. Clearly, in most indicators, either you are seeing flattish trends or, some signs of moderations compared to, Q1 of last year.
Mr. Bhattacharya, also want to get your sense on what the central bank action could be now, given that we have seen such slowdown, a 9-month low on the IIP, and we've heard commentary coming in from the governor this time around that front loading has already happened. Do you believe that effect could trickle in and maybe we could see some improvement, or do you believe that this calls for more rate cuts to boost demand?
So Kapil, if I can just step back a little bit, you asked about the PMI. So one thing that I should note is that the PMI is not a YOY number. PMI is a diffusion index. So whatever the last number for May is actually relative to what the PMI number was showing in April. So that was actually a contraction, because this is month on month. This is not year on year. So you're actually seeing a contraction in manufacturing relative from what the PMI number showing. On your second question, main question on rate cuts, we need to wait and watch. I mean, the front-loaded rate cuts will have an impact. This will already have transmitted into a significant amount of lending rates, particularly to the MSME segment, manufacturing MSME and services MSME. So we need to wait and watch how things go. Credit growth has been relatively slow. We don't know whether this is due to a supply problem or a demand problem. My own guess is this is more a reflection of low demand for credit, particularly from the small and medium enterprises. So we need to wait and watch how demand recovery. I have a feeling that given the steps that the government has taken in terms of the tax rate cuts, etc., that should, and the effects of the transmission on mortgage rates. So the existing mortgage holders will also have an increase in disposable income. So I have a feeling that this will slowly begin to boost demand, as a consequence of which there will be an increased demand for more capacity to feed into this existing demand. So at that point in time, you will begin to see an increase in credit growth.
Very well put together, that explanation, Mr. Bhattacharya. Thank you so much for that. But Sakshi, want to ask you a slightly tricky question. It's a slightly off the textbook kind of question. Given the kind of numbers that we've seen on IIP right now, does that by any chance maybe affect the long-term GDP or rather the FY26 GDP forecast that you have for the country?
I think it's too early to say, what sort of, because we are just about, 1 quarter into this year. I think we have, we still don't have clarity on a lot of the global events or the global headwinds, both in terms of, what are the final nature of trade deals, whether the US economy is going into a major slowdown, because that's a headwind for us, how monsoon progress. I mean, although there is optimism around that, but how the distribution of monsoon is going to be in the month of July and August, which are very, very important, from the perspective of sowing. So I think there is a lot more that we kind of need to assess before, commenting on whether growth is which direction growth is moving in. So I wouldn't necessarily, extrapolate today's IIP number in saying that, look, growth is slowing down for FY26 meaningfully. And, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of counter-cyclical supports that are going to start kind of propping up and supporting GDP growth as we move into the coming year. So both from the monetary policy perspective, not just in terms of interest rate cuts, but also the liquidity support, and combined with that, a lot of front loading of expenditure, both from the center and hopefully from the states. I think we'll kind of, that interlinked with how global headwinds pan out will perhaps give us a better picture of, where GDP growth is going to end up for FY26.
Right, so too early to comment on GDP, and lots of other factors to also pencil in when it comes to GDP. That's the take coming in from Sakshi. But Mr. Bhattacharya, as we wrap up this conversation, wanted to take your last opinion on another economic metric that we're tracking right now, and that's the fiscal deficit data that's come in for April to May. I'll read out the numbers to you. It's come in at 1,31,163 crore rupees. So that's 1.3 lakh crore rupees, which makes up 0.8% of FY FY26 budget target. April to May total expenditure is at 7.46 lakh crores compared to 1.3 lakh 1 crores of the fiscal deficit. Sir, any first takes on what you are making of this deficit number?
No. So these are very good numbers. I mean, with particularly given what happened last year. I think the government has a fairly large room to increase spending, particularly given the dividend that it has received from the RBI. Plus all the other, even though tax collections have been a little low, but the tax collections, the lower tax gross and net tax collections can be explained in terms of the initial effects of the tax cuts that have been given. So there's more disposable income. So more disposable income in terms of private sector households, as well as increased space for the government, partially due to the RBI dividend to increase spending. So we are in a good spot. We are in a good spot in terms of potential spends to be able to revive growth.
Okay, so that's the take on the number that we have seen. But on that note, we'll wrap it up on this conversation of us tracking India's macros. Mr. Bhattacharya and Sakshi, thank you so much for joining us on the show.